as we've seen, Cassette Vision games took a lot of inspiration, let's call it that, from existing arcade games. And while they didn't get into any trouble with the woodcutter game Yosaku, Namco was a much larger company, and they definitely noticed people selling something on store shelves called Galaxian. Epoch wound up working something out with Namco where they paid them a licensing fee for the game, but that was after it had already been released. And the really quirky thing about that deal is that Cassette Vision Galaxian is not a port of Galaxian. It's an unauthorized port of Nichibutsu's Mooncresta. Mooncresta was one of many games to follow in the wake of Space Invaders and Galaxian to give you a wave of enemies descending from the top of the screen. Mooncresta was notable among these early games for the more complicated and aggressive enemy patterns, and sequences where you attempted to dock your ship if you progressed far enough. Now, the Cassette Vision Galaxian isn't Mooncresta exactly, but the programmer has stated that he was inspired by that game, and I feel like you can really see the inspiration here. Now, I have to make a quick detour to 2023 with this. Capturing footage from the original Cassette Vision is a bit of a nightmare. The Cassette Vision uses a very soft color palette, almost pastel, and modern capture hardware really likes bleeding out the luminosity of those colors. So in my default setup, it looked almost black and white. And I wasn't happy with that because Galaxian is one of the better looking Cassette Vision games. It takes advantage of the low resolution of the game's pixels and the minimum color palette. All of the enemies are constantly cycling colors in this rainbow effect, and they swirl hypnotically on the screen as they go. And it's really hard to see that with this footage. I was tempted to create a 1980s style video capture box around my CRT, and then record video footage right from that. The Cassette Vision's hardware really was designed for a television of the era, taking advantage of the different reactions of the phosphors on the screen, and it's something that's very difficult to replicate digitally. Okay, back to the game itself. Since it's based on those very early days of arcade shooters, there isn't a whole lot to Galaxian. No power-ups, and not even a whole lot of game options. There's basically two game modes here. The default one, which gives you more lives and makes the game slower, and the second one, which speeds things up to be more arcade-like. I think on all of these Cassette Vision games, it's always better to play the arcade mode. The controls are one of the levers and any of the push buttons. You always move back and forth in a plane at the bottom of the screen, and all of the buttons fire your gun. You go through 4 stages of action, and then the game loops. On the first stage, you've got these swirling rocks. When you hit the large ones, they'll break apart into 2, and sometimes they'll break apart on their own. Cassette Vision Galaxian genuinely reminds me of the Atari 2600 Asteroids, not because of those splitting enemies, but because they obviously knew that they couldn't recreate the original, so they made a version of that which played to their hardware limitations, and the result was one of the best games for the system. The second stage tends to feature enemies that will fly in, become missiles, and drop down the screen rapidly. There isn't a huge variety of enemy styles in the game, but there are enough to keep you on your toes. The third stage simply adds more enemies. You get some that will swoop down at you from an angle. One of the biggest challenges in playing Galaxian is that the swinging motion of a lot of the enemies tends to box you in at the edge of the screen, setting you up for an attack from something else. The fourth stage, before everything starts looping, is no longer a shooter. Instead, pressing the fire button ignites your engine, sending your ship upward, and you'll have to navigate between the rocks that are flying back and forth, and dock with the UFO at the top of the screen. It's easier said than done, and you only have one shot at it. If you crash and lose a life, then it just goes on to the next stage. There's a time limit on these UFO stages, and if that runs out, or you miss the UFO when you're docking, then you lose a life. On the other hand, if you successfully dock, then you get an extra life. And that's it, the game loops until you run out of lives. A key thing to understand about video games in 1981 is that unless you were playing an RPG, adventure, or strategy game on a computer, then the typical game experience was only supposed to be about 3 to 5 minutes long. A console like the Cassette Vision lets you play repeatedly instead of popping in your 100 yen coins, but it was intended for short bursts of play. A half-hour session with one of these games would be long, so the small amount of content in Galaxian isn't really an issue. Also, this is one of the very few Cassette Vision games where I feel that the control scheme is good. The game is built around a two-directional stick and a fire button. So this is one instance where the console's weird control scheme doesn't interfere with how you play. You could even use either the left or right joystick. Galaxian just works. And that's more than I can say for many Cassette Vision games.